This is Euroscopic, a podcast brief about what happened this week, how we got here, and where we're going. I'm William Glucroft.
And this is Martin Gack.
You can find this podcast and other essays at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com. And of course, you can subscribe wherever your ears go for podcasts. Like, comment, share, you know the drill. If you like it, let us know, and a friend or two of yours as well. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, July 26th, 2023. I meant to say that I love that you're sticking with the pandemic era bookcase as your preferred backdrop.
It's not. See, so what happens is that this is not quite a set. These are actually, look, they're books.
Do you read? Those are real books?
Those are things that you can open, and there are letters inside. Look.
This is, I don't know.
Yeah,
over on TikTok, they don't let us have books on TikTok.
I know. Well, that's what I hear, but this is why I'm keeping them. This is why I keep myself in papyrus.com. But I only buy literature. I only read literature. I don't read anything that has been written in the last 60 or 70 years.
Nobody needs things from people that are still alive.
I think we should at some point discuss the state of culture, right? I do.
Well, this week would be. This week we are in the grips of the IP overlords with the Barbie movie and the Oppenheimer.
I just cannot really even get started with the Barbie movie. I mean, this shows the power of this PR machine, right? Which you have enough. You can pay enough influencers across various digital platforms. And all of a sudden, it looks like everybody's actually talking about this crap, when as a matter of fact, it's really just pay goons who are mixing themselves into the crowd. So, 1921 anarchist style, just put a couple of rebel rousers into the crowd and have them cover their face. They will never know they were actually working for the government.
But speaking of there being no new ideas and us being trapped in sort of this 1990s nostalgia, the silly story of the week for me was the Mickey D's chicken nuggets, McNuggets lawsuit, where an 8-year-old girl in Florida was awarded $800,000 for being burned by a McNugget 4 years ago when she was 4 years old. And I just couldn't, this just harkens back to the early 1990s, the famous coffee case, which is why we all now need to be coddled by corporate America to be told that our hot beverages are hot.
I mean, the coffee case was remarkable because on the one hand, it was actually a very serious burn. I actually took the trouble back of reading through the story. I mean, and there was, of course, a lot of technical measurements as to the optimal temperature of coffee. And it turns out that this elderly lady that got burned had a very, very severe burns. We usually complain about European regulation, but I mean, as a matter of fact, one of the things that the U.S. has produced is sort of regulatory vigilantism, right? I mean, what the government will not do, you have essentially various forms of ambulance chasers, lawyers, different sorts, which consider themselves, I mean, like demigods in many cases, sort of making absolutely sure that, more and more and more and more regulations will be produced. Obviously, one cannot judge what the situation for this child was, but I mean, it is quite clear that the lawyerly hand is over all this thing to be seen, right?
The not so invisible lawyerly hand. I mean, you made a good point because the woman in the early 90s, the coffee case, she was vilified in the press and she kind of became a thing of legend as someone who sort of took advantage of the system. But she was seriously burned. I think the bigger question is in both of these cases is if you just compare the U.S. and Germany, the U.S., you can walk away with millions of dollars in pain and suffering. And in Germany, you might walk away with $1,000. I think it's not so much whether people have the right to sue for damages. It's just kind of eye-popping how much, the extent to which you can get in the U.S. How do you put a price on pain and suffering? An emotional damage, I don't know. Whereas in Germany, you have the other extreme where good luck getting anybody to pay up for your pain and suffering. That's not their problem.
I think that that's actually a very interesting point. It's a delicate balance in some sense. Obviously, a second ago, I was actually bemoaning the emergence of the lawyerly class, which is actually essentially just, trading and producing jobs, by the way, because obviously the moment that you have to take care of making sure that the coffee is at the right temperature, then there has to be an administrator, a certificator, a temperature, or thermometer, etc. So, I mean, in some sense, it's very useful. But on the other hand, I think that what should be recognized, keeping in mind the absolute dismal state of customer protection or consumer protection across Europe, really, and Germany being particularly awful, is that, as a matter of fact, this kind of threat of economic punishment for companies would probably go a very long way in Europe, and particularly in Germany, to improve the state of play for industry, economics, commerce, and innovation. The point is, I can understand all of these things and limitations, but at some point, specifically, the question is, if you're going to sell a service that you're not delivering, then you're actually stealing. And this is something that in Germany in particular happens across the board. You can see this sort of in the transportation system. You can see this in like the service industries. It's really just breathtaking in a way.
This was a week full of sort of the public square, having its voice heard. I guess the big story, maybe you want to take this. I know this is your bread and butter, Martin, is the Spanish elections.
We thought that we would see the PP, the Partido Popular, which is essentially the center-right with some really sort of far-right leanings, take the first position and then become government to succeed Pedro Sanchez. We knew that everybody knew, not just we, but that they would not have enough votes, so they would need actually a junior partner. They had pretty much accepted that their junior partner would be a bunch of fascist fossils. Pedro Sanchez came in with a lot more votes than was expected, which means that essentially the PP and the right cannot form government. Okay, so fast-tracking the issue, how will this play out? Well, the socialists also need a junior partner. They don't have enough with their sort of association of groups. The thing that is truly crazy about this is that now to stop the fascists essentially emerging into Madrid, what you need is once again the Republican Catalonians, many of them in exile. In fact, Carles Puigdemont is still in Brussels. So the question is, what is that they are going to be asking of Pedro Sanchez in order to basically do one of two things, either give him the votes of the bloc or abstain? Because in fact, in order to become government in Spain, you need to have not only positive votes, but you need to have more positive votes in the parliament than negative votes, than votes against you. So this is actually the reason why the PP cannot make it in. One of the things that the Catalonians could ask is essentially an amnesty for everybody. That would make, of course, Sanchez extremely unpopular in a lot of the center-right, but it might be a price that they decide to ask for. It would be a very risky business, because if actually Sanchez says no, he could call a second set of elections that would come in December. And then at that point, it might well be that people scared of the Catalonians going completely crazy from Brussels, and I'm talking here about the Junts, the independentists, they would actually move to the right and bring Vox, so essentially a fascist party, into the government.
It feels like yesterday, but of course it was before the pandemic, that, secession was at the heart of Europe, that one of Europe's major economies was literally facing the very real possibility of losing its most industrious, one of its most economically important regions of the country. And there was this manhunt for Puigdemont. There was, it was like a bad Hollywood action thriller. And 5 years later, 6 years later, he's the kingmaker.
Yes, it is breathtaking. I mean, and if you think of Puigdemont, visually, it's really not exactly Indiana Jones, right? It's a man with too much of bangs directly above his eyes.
He does need a haircut, that's true.
Figure. But the fact is that he has managed to, I think it's a combination of him managing actually to maneuver himself in a position of a lot of power, because actually, as you just mentioned, Catalonia remains economically very powerful, although they systematically get the short end of the stick. So there was a set of demands that were administrative, fiscal, and infrastructural demands, because there is also a problem with development. If in Catalonia, they have a lot of money that they produce, but they don't get money back even for infrastructural development. So it could be that that is actually what Puigdemont decides to request. He remains in Brussels, he remains a year a deputy, and that is the way that the request goes.
So I feel like, much like Italy, elections are always happening in Spain. So tell me, why does this matter?
Let's say that we actually were to have an election in December, and the PP were to come in with more votes and enough to actually just bring Vox into government. Now what you would have is a coalescing far-right wave around Europe. So Vox would actually have renewed force, and this means that actually people associated with Meloni, with Orban, with the PIS in Poland, with the right in the Scandinavian countries, would actually begin to look like a more solid bloc that could have major effects in the European Union. One of the effects would be actually potentially to introduce changes in the Commission and bring some very disagreeable characters into the Commission. You could find yourself in a situation which you have, the position that Borrell has now, which is foreign policy, disastrous as he is. I mean, he truly is a catastrophe, but at least he's not a Nazi. So I think that, this is something that could actually change. The way that somebody who has held ambiguous relations with Russia, for instance, like the people around Meloni, around Salvini, which in Italy is part of the alliance, Vox itself, which has had sort of strange relations with ideologically right-wing Russian groups. I mean, there is really quite a list of this. Could, for instance, radically shift, the way in which Europe approaches Russia and Ukraine.
This always feels like to me like a zombie movie. Like the zombies are coming, and you can fight them and you can kill them. But at some point they break through and then they attack you, and then you become the zombie. And so who attacks you when you're the zombie? The dramatic scene in the zombie film where your loved one who you've been defending against the zombies becomes a zombie herself. What do? You have to kill the person you love. And that's how I always feel this about these far right or anti-democratic forces creeping into the center of European power. Well, what happens when European power itself is run by these far-right or anti-democratic forces?
That's a great analogy, because as a matter of fact, we have seen it, right? I mean, they could live in Merkel loved Renzi, then von der Leyen loved Conte, and by the time that Conte made Draghi fall, which essentially was actually the most popular politician in Italy by the time that he was brought down by Conte, at that point, I mean, obviously, the European Union, Brussels, began to see essentially its little lovely Italy sort of fall into the hands of these dark forces.
So where else are we going then? What else did we see this week that caught your eye, Martin?
Well, let me ask you, what were you following?
You can't ask back what I asked. That's bad improv play.
It is true. I mean, but I never had improv training, so
it's like. All right. Well, I mean, what I find fascinating, these stories of tourism versus climate change, especially all across Europe, as Greece once again burns out of control, and other tourist hotspots. There's this question of, tourism is important economically. I think I saw a figure, something like 2 billion euros it generates for Europe, the European Union overall. But at the same time, tourism is a driving factor of climate change, has horrible ecological impacts in areas where that tourism takes place, and B, is very unpleasant for the tourists when they're there if their resort is on fire. Policymakers are all for climate change mitigation or reduction, and know what the answers are, the solutions are. We know we have to consume less. We know we can't fly as much, and yet, for the economy's sake, we have to fly, we have to travel, we have to consume.
I mean, I think that also against the backdrop of very, very concrete economic needs that ultimately also latch onto questions of political stability, right? So, I mean, if you have had 3 years of a very slow moving machine, obviously, I mean, and we have talked about, I mean, often, at least in journalistic circles, I mean, we have heard a lot about the blessings, the environmental blessings of the pandemic. I mean, they turned the waters of Venice into crystal lakes in which you could see dolphins and mermaids just sort of going through La Serenissima channels. But I think that the point is that you also have a lot of people that need to eat and need to get to their job and need to feed their children. And many of those are tour operators, and many of those are, people picking up olives in order to sell olive oil to tourists and so on and so forth. So it is really a very big question. Also, the fact is that a lot of the environmental impact policies that are kind of being navigated in a more gentle manner, in Europe, are then exported, right? So I mean, if basically most of your dirty laundry is being done in China, and then the gray water is being thrown into sort of, the sea, as they say. I mean, I think that the idea of a European environmental policy without seriously addressing China and India and so on and so forth, to which we contribute economically, essentially is like having a swimming pool with a urinator and non-urinator section. But these are issues that, I don't think are easily addressable. And I think that one of the problems with this is that, as you have seen, is that the far right of the type that just sort of popped up in Spain, that just popped up in Holland with the tractor people, as you might remember, which ultimately kind of brought down the Rutte government, in the Gilets Jaunes in France. I mean, a lot of these people are actually, not to mention, I mean, Germany, AfD, where there is a lot of environmental skepticism. They are latching on to many of these policies as essentially policies that are going to directly affect the economic of families on the ground, which gives, once again, this very large space for political exercise to some very unsavory groups and operators.
It's a development happening this week, but I feel like I'm just stuck in Groundhog's Day, because you can pre-write these stories the last several summers. Every summer now is the worst summer ever, the worst wildfires ever. I don't even know how Greece has, and parts of Italy still have trees to burn, to be perfectly honest.
I mean, I can tell you that, of my Italian life in Puglia. So 2 days ago, I talked to close friends who were reporting in the province of Bari. There is a city called Casamassima, which is an important commercial center. It was 49 degrees. 49
Unreal.
Degrees. It's truly remarkable, So, I think that a lot of people were thinking, well, yes, it's going to get hot, but it's going to be over the next 30 years. Maybe my great grandchildren will actually, see their blood essentially evaporate as they step out to go for milk. It turns out that it was just like 3 months away.
The Earth, by the time those great grandkids are around, the Earth will be Venus, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think that it took a lot of people, including political groups, by surprise. We don't know what kind of impact that will have in electoral processes. But what we do know is that it will have no impact at all in the business community, and it will have no impact at all on sort of market economy projects, which will, continue to insist that, regulation is just not good for us. The thing that I'm actually, the big one for me this week is, we didn't mention it at all in the last couple of minutes, but it's Israel, which is Israel is going
dancing around. We've been dancing around the golden calf, I would say.
Yeah, yes, we have. I mean, the problem is that everybody in Germany is afraid of touching it, and obviously, if we touch it, we run certain risks. But
even the German government, I think today said they are gravely concerned with developments in Israel.
Are you absolutely sure there was not a question mark at the end of the statement?
I will not speak to question marks or not, but I believe the quote was serious or grave concerns, depending how you want to translate it exactly. So we might be somewhat unsafe territory. I mean, I think we should thank Benjamin Netanyahu for at least making it somewhat more politically palpable or palatable to be able to criticize Israel in places like Germany, thanks to his his coalitions and current government's extremely nationalistic and far-right religious bent. It's at least made certain previously unspeakable or impolite conversation a little bit more acceptable to say in polite company.
I would say that I would grant him three things. The first one is the one indeed you just mentioned. Europeans and particularly Germans have found some way, even if it's with sort of conspicuous question marks at the end, such as, we're gravely concerned by what's happening in Israel. Talking like, a sophomore girl up talking just to make sure that the statement is not confused with a full-on condemnation. The second one is, as a matter of fact, that I think it has shaken the Jewish community across the board, particularly in the U.S., out of this sort of zombified complacency in which, well, yes, maybe they smell a little bit, but they're members of the tribe. Exactly. They're mishpucha, and therefore, it's okay. I think that that's actually completely over. And surprising to me, it was not as Netanyahu was pushing, Orban's conspiracy theories against the international Jew, that is Soros, of course, but it's now where actually he has directly attacked the Jewish community in the US and so on. The third thing, and I think to me this is really the big one, is that by the complete unintended consequence of this might be that in fact we see a progressive slide into a one-state solution, which is not necessarily one that would be secular and democratic immediately. I mean, it would probably remain essentially an ethno-religious state with a very strong, theocratic imprint, if not fully theocratic, certainly. More theocratic as the days go by, though. But that's actually, unless it's really a full system of theocratic oppression, Iran style, and I don't think that you could really do that in Tel Aviv. I don't see how that would happen. Unless
the beach is too tempting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that what you would have is progressively a necessary inclusion of the different parts. And by this, I certainly do not mean just Palestinians or Muslims or Christians, but you would need to find a way back into the political fold of, progressive Jews, reformist Jews, gay Jews, transgender Jews. I mean, every Jew that does not jibe with this coalition would need to be given some sort of space back in the democratic Israel.
American policy towards Israel has been heavily shaped by pro-Israel lobbying support, the AIPACification of Israeli policy, and of course Cold War politics and these kinds of things. Of course, Israel was very useful for the United States in its various proxy conflicts with the Soviet Union, but the American Jewish community has been for decades now, very skeptical of the right wing, the slow but accelerating right wing lurch of Israeli politics. But willing to give it a pass because, as we say, it's mishpucha. And nowadays, you're seeing some serious breaking of this taboo, so to speak. And where that goes, if that really has staying power, if people are really, if sort of your mainstream middle class liberal American Jew is willing to wake up and see maybe not the full Iranification of Israel, but a semi-Iranification of Israeli politics. That's the big question mark, and how that will then affect American policy and how that might influence what's going on in Israel. Because of course, people like Netanyahu want nothing more than every Jew to come to Israel. But of course, Israel is nothing without its diaspora putting political pressure in their home countries, in France, in the UK, in Australia, in the United States, etc. If that starts to break, if that diaspora homeland connection starts to break, that's, I think, where we're going to see some what you've discussed about this, a progressive hope.
So what do you think we have coming for next week? What do you think?
Well, of course, a lot of places will still be burning, I think, next week. We're going to have, I think, more fallout or more to talk about in terms of the collapse of the grain deal, because later this week, Vladimir Putin is having a conference with African leaders. And of course, he's going to be making a push for selling Russian grain, saving African countries from both inflation and food scarcity with Russian grain instead of Ukrainian grain. So I think we're going to be seeing more developments there. It'll be interesting to see where public and political support in these various countries that are so reliant on stable food prices and stable food supplies from Ukraine and Russia, how those change vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, based on what happens in the wake of the end of this grain deal.
I actually hate talking about climate. I feel like, an old lady that just sort of runs out of topics and talks about the weather, but it is really quite imposing. I mean, the extremes are quite imposing, and the kind of weather patterns we're seeing are quite frightening.
There'll always be the weather to talk about, and everybody always wants to talk about the weather. And as I believe Mark Twain said, everyone talks about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it.
You've been listening to Euroscopic with William Bluecroft and Martin Gack. Written by us, produced by us, and edited by me. If you liked what you heard, like us, subscribe to us, leave us a comment, tell us what you think, and share us with a friend. You can find us at Substack, that's euroscopic.substack.com, and our podcast wherever podcasts are heard. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.